Diana, before you sit down, can I just pass this? I'm going to talk about my granddad, because I know you're thinking of your relatives and loved ones and people that you hold in the light who are kind of looking down on you and protecting you. And you can pass that around. This is my maternal Jimmy and Susie Malcolmson. And it was taken when they were in their probably 20s, and their second child is standing, who died of, he had a brain tumor. I think he died before he was 6, and they lost their first child. So they had a tough beginnings. But there is a family legend about Jimmy that he was associated with the picking up of the survivors or the salvaging of the Titanic. And it was a family legend that I'd heard about and was passed down. And the story was linked to his atheism, because this was such a traumatic experience for him that he couldn't believe that there was a God above to allow something so awful to happen to people. And online you can research the cruise of the Carpathia. So I was online in 2012, the 100th anniversary, trying to figure out, what was his role, because he died when I was 3 years old, and his name wasn't on the list. So the only thing that I could imagine was that he was part of the flotilla of ships that went out from Nova Scotia to pick up the bodies and the remains and debris that was on the ocean. And the most famous ship in that convoy was the Mackie Bennett. And you can actually read a daily account of what happened when that ship went out and they began finding bodies and picking up bodies, and how the crew and how there was a chaplain who did a burial at sea. And the way it worked, because there was something like 600 bodies that were recovered in some form, but they weren't all brought back to shore. If you were if you could be identified as a first-class passenger, you were embalmed and put in a coffin. A second-class passenger was wrapped in a tarpaulin and brought into shore for identification and burial. And if you were a third-class passenger, you were given a funeral and you were buried at sea. And in some ways, we think that's kind of hard and harsh this day and age, but it reflected the cultural and political and social values of the time. The captain of the Mackie Bennett was asked when they came ashore why they were doing this, and he said, "No prominent man was recommitted to the deep. It seemed best to embalm as quickly as possible in those cases where large property might be involved. Best to be sure to bring back to land the dead where death might give rise to such questions as large insurance and inheritance and all the litigation." And they kept records of these people, these bodies that they found. Number 124, male, estimated age 50, hair and mustache, light. Clothing, blue serge suit, blue handkerchief with AV, belt with gold buckle, brown boots with red rubber soles, brown flannel shirt, JJA on the back of his collar. Effects: gold watch, cufflinks, gold with diamond, diamond ring with 3 stones, 225 pounds in English notes, $2,440 in notes, what it cost to build this church, 5 pounds in gold, 7 shillings in silver, 5 10-franc pieces, gold pencil, pocketbook, first class, name John Jacob Astor. He was the richest passenger on board the Titanic. His wealth, the equivalent today, is about $2.5 billion. And he was buried it was a big funeral at Trinity Church, Wall Street, and a big service at Church of the Messiah, which is a church that he built. So he was on, one of the wealthiest people, and they found his body and they brought his body to shore. The crew also discovered the body of a 19-month-old child. And there were many children that went down with the ship. And the little child's remains, these hardened sailors, these tough men, some of them probably had children of their own, were touched to their heart's core. Number 4, male, estimated age 2, hair fair, clothing gray coat with fur on collar and cuffs, brown serge frock, petticoat, flannel garment, pink woolen singlet, brown shoes and stockings, no marks whatever, probably third class. And instructions were given to the men to commit the little boy's remains to the deep. But the crew rebelled, and they decided that they were going to collect the money to pay for the casket and bring this little child to shore. And it was a kind of symbolic defiance. And there was a little white hearse that was paid for. The 75 sailors lined the route to the burial site. They put a little medal in the casket saying, "Our babe." And they erected a tombstone that said, "To an unknown child." And the place was covered in flowers. The local school children sent flowers. And it was this very symbolic moment of inclusion that these very brave men made it happen. And the moral behind that story is that the human condition is not always as predictable as some of us might think. Stories like these give us hope and light in the dark chapters of our shared histories and personal despair that human beings are simply beyond redemption, or we are so predictable and concerned about ourselves and our own survival and our own needs that we disconnect from the larger narrative. Human suffering and tragedy can strike at any time and knows no distinction of age, sex, or class. We are in this together, and the dignity and grace of the simple action of the Mackie Bennett crew against social convention and even company orders represents a kind of hopeful anarchy. All is not forever conditioned and fixed in stone. And we may be surprised from time to time of how we react, of how we are broken open in holiness. My grandfather, I was only 3. I remember as a child, he was the first dead body I saw. In Ireland, we were always, we weren't protected from death and dying. It was a part of life. And I remember being lifted over his coffin at 3 years old and seeing him lying there. But he asked the existential question, where was God in all of this? And for him, he couldn't find an answer. And so he he stopped believing in the Santa Claus God in the sky, who always gives us what we want, and we give him up when we don't get it. There was a film that had been lost for 90 years of the crew returning on the Carpathia, bringing the living, the survivors of the Titanic, back to New York. And it was found in some garden shed in Brighton. And what was really moving about that film was that this crew, these young men that had spent a couple of days from the site of the tragedy into New York City, had provided care and love and support to people who had lost everything. And the answer I would give to my grandfather would be, where is God? God was in you. God was in the hearts of those young sailors, incarnated in you, providing that solace and support. And that holiness is within us. And sometimes it's these tragedies that kind of break us open. And that's why the saints, remembering the saints today, is really important. They represent this symbolic people who, that child, that family, we know now who that child is, Sidney Goodwin. They did a DNA testing. And his whole family was lost on that ship. But it's very interesting that if you go to that cemetery today, that little headstone to an unknown child is still covered in toys and flowers, because it symbolizes something else of who we are as human beings. And if you see that holiness, that child and that family didn't plan on that, but that they become a kind of symbolic way in which the better part of who we are as human beings is brought to bear. And so that's how I want us to think about the saints today. Unlikely people. We think about the church kind of does us all a disservice. Saints are in stained glass windows, or they have halos on their heads, or they're dressed in medieval garb, or they have to kind of walk on water. That's not what the saints is really about. The reading today in Ephesians, it talks that all the people of God are saints. We're all saints. And how we are inspired in the holiness of one another. And that wonderful reference of Jesus, how can the sorrowful and the poor and the persecuted find a state of blessedness? And the values of the world are kind of turned upside down. I have this little book called Exploring by my friend Jim Cotter, who died last year. And he writes the Beatitudes in a modern kind of idiom. And I want to read a couple to you to get a sense of what these familiar words might mean in a different way. Blessed are the peacemakers, they will be called the daughters and the sons of God. He says this: we are blighted. He uses the word blighted as the opposite of blessed. We are blighted when we are at war with ourselves, when we spread evil and division and hatred, seeking to dominate others. We breed our own downfall, and we never know trust and friendship. We are blessed when we create reconciliation and goodwill wherever we go. Returning good for evil, we are indeed the friends of God. Another one: we are blighted when our lives are shallow and full of fear, so that we cannot respond in truth when we are challenged. We freeze in death. We are blessed when we shed our pettiness and know the deep things of God and of ourselves, and so persevere at whatever the cost: insult, slander, exile, death. We have life and know it abundantly. So that's a very different way of thinking about being blessed. And I was looking at the history of why All Saints. Why is All Saints on November 1st? Why do we celebrate it? And I go back to the history books tell us that in 609, the emperor gave the Pantheon, which is a beautiful building. Many of us have visited Rome and seen the Pantheon. It's an extraordinary building that was a pagan temple. And it has all these artifacts from ancient Rome. The doors of the Roman Senate are still on the Pantheon, and pillars from other famous buildings. So Pope Boniface was given the building by Emperor Phocas in 609. And he turned it, this pagan temple, into a church. And how he did it was he went into the catacombs of Rome and he collected 24 carts of the bones of the martyrs. So it's a bit like going to the grave of this little child. And he collected these stories, people that had done amazing, brave, courageous things that perhaps had been forgotten. And those bones were ceremoniously put under the high altar of this new church that was dedicated to Holy Mother of God and of all the Christian martyrs. And once its hordes of devils had been cast out, it became a memorial to the company of saints. And in the 7th century, between the 5th and the 7th centuries, there was a reliquary at St. Peter's built, and it was, instead of the 13th of May, which traditionally was All Saints' Day, it was changed to November the 1st. And incidentally, November 1st is also the Celtic holy day of Samhain, which is basically a harvest festival. So we've got harvest going on, we've got the celebration of the light, and the saints and the ordinary people with their stories that have been forgotten. And so we can imagine the impact a little baby who died because of human folly and misplaced trust in technology, the unsinkable Titanic. How arrogant is that? And in some ways, the Titanic represents the end of innocence for that generation. 2 years later, 1914, the world breaks out in the First World War. And progress and technology, and we're all doing so well, boom. And so the Titanic is a kind of reminder of our own folly and our own holiness. And so as we celebrate the saints today, let us hold up these examples, and you can imagine and think about people that you know. Sometimes people that we know who are facing an illness or a loss, we see a transformation in them that is holy, that the holiness is broken open out of their hearts, and that they become something that they didn't expect. Kind of surprised by these curveballs, the unexpected that come our way, and seeing people courageously lean into the wind and learning to love the questions. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And that is the holiness that we celebrate on this day. I'm going to end with one more of my friend Jim Cotter's quotes. We are blighted when we wallow in self-pity. We sink into bitterness and despair. We are blessed when we accept our experience of sorrow. We grow in courage and in compassion. Amen.